Now, for the reason you're all here, I'd like to introduce Dr. Todd Bostwick. He's our executive director. We're really privileged to have him as our executive director. For those of you who don't know, he spent 23 years as the city archaeologist for the city of Phoenix. So he's had a lot of experience. He's happy to be here with us. We're happy to have him. He's done so much for us already. Let's give Todd a warm welcome.
Well, thank you for coming. It's so nice to see so many smiling faces. Today I'm going to share the story of the circumstances under which a 72-year-old former Latin teacher undertook the largest scale excavation of a ruin in the Upper Verde during the Great Depression. And in fact, the excavations that his team did in the 30s still stands as the largest excavation ever undertaken in this region. So it's a very important project, and obviously Tuzigoot as a national monument is a very important site. But a lot of people are not aware of Byron Cummings' role in those excavations, so I want to talk about him, his history, how he came to be the person that did the excavations, and then I'm going to talk about what they found, some of the interesting archaeology, and the conclusions that they reached from their excavations. Byron Cummings was actually from upstate New York. He received his master's degree from Rutgers College in ancient languages and literature. In other words, he spoke fluent Latin and Greek, which was required in most university curriculums back then, so it was a very important position. He was always interested in ancient cultures, but his focus was on the languages. However, in 1893, he decided to come west. Apparently he had some respiratory problems, and so he was hired at the University of Utah, which used to be the University of Deseret, a Mormon university, and they wanted to make it a broader student base, and so they expanded their faculty, and he came out to teach Greek and Latin, of course. So when he was in Utah, he did a lot of training and classes out in the community, and so he was on the road a lot, and he saw a lot of ruins. He became interested in archaeology, but it was just an interest. And then he met Edgar Hewitt at a lecture, just like this, in Salt Lake City, for the Archaeological Institute of America, which was the major archaeological organization in the United States at the time, in 1905 and 6. And he became good friends with Dr. Hewitt, and he joined the organization. And then, with just some instructions through letters, he became an archaeologist. Literally, I found the letters. The letters say, okay, this is what you do if you're going to be an archaeologist. He read them. He was a smart guy. He said, okay, I can do that. And then he went out into the wilderness and started finding sites for Hewitt. Hewitt was stationed in Santa Fe, couldn't make it out to Utah, so Cummings became his agent of that region. And there's a lot of interest in the archaeology of Utah, of course, because of spectacular archaeology out there. And you may not be aware, but Hewitt is actually the individual that wrote the Federal Antiquities Act of 1906, which was the first and most important legislation that was created to protect archaeological sites on federal property. So Hewitt is a very important individual in the history of archaeology and essentially became the mentor for Cummings. And Cummings got so excited about his first foray into the Utah wilderness that he decided that he wanted to do that as often as possible. And so in 1909 and 1910, he did this great exploration of the Four Corners area, primarily Utah and northern Arizona. This is actually a map that he produced in 1910. And I want to point out that there is an important feature here that intrigued him, is Rainbow Bridge over here. And at that time, Rainbow Bridge was only a rumor. It was a legend. Of course, Native Americans knew about it, but no Anglo had ever been to Rainbow Bridge. And so he was part of the team that actually rediscovered. I don't say discovered because if the Native Americans already know it, then you're not really discovering it, you're rediscovering it. But he became very famous. One of the members of the team was John Wetherill, who was a well-known individual. He befriended John Wetherill. They became very close, family friends. In fact, Cummings' wife actually did babysitting for the Wetherill's children and even mentored them when they came down and visited him in Tucson when he was living down there later. Now, with his notoriety, he decided that he was going to be a full-fledged archaeologist while he was teaching Latin and Greek at the University of Utah. And so between 1909 and 1914, he actually explored hundreds of canyons with his young son, who always went with him, Malcolm. I think Malcolm is 10 years old at this time. And this is John Wetherill here, because Wetherill often went with him. Wetherill, of course, had his trading post in Kayenta in northeastern Arizona, but had downtime, and he spent that with Cummings. Notice the wonderful snake image here on this wall in this cliff dwelling. One of the important things about Cummings' explorations at this time is that most of the ruins were absolutely pristine. They had not been pot hunted. Many of them had never been seen by Anglos before, and so it was a very important period in southwestern archaeology for finding and observing ruins that were still intact and not vandalized or otherwise pot hunted. Unfortunately, since Cummings' training had been primarily the letters that I mentioned, he was not the best field archaeologist, and he's been severely criticized by modern-day archaeologists because of that. And they've unfortunately not realized all the other contributions that he made to archaeology, which I'll talk about in just a minute. There was a major dispute at the University of Utah. The president was a draconian president, and there was mass firings and resignations at the university, and Cummings decided it was time to get out of Utah. And he was very fortunate that he knew Charlotte Hall, who was the resident poet of Arizona in Prescott, and she told him about a position that was opening up at the University of Arizona, which was to create an archaeology department and to manage their museum. And so he said, this is a great opportunity. He came down to Tucson. That's actually where the current agriculture building is actually the building that he moved into, and he found the exhibit that the museum that he was supposed to be developing was a bunch of artifacts piled in a corner of a room. But he took the task on. He was an extremely energetic individual. He was a short person, but he had more energy than most people half his age. He was a very dedicated individual, extremely intelligent, and so he took his task on very seriously. So now, not only do you have a field archaeologist that has very little training, now you have head of an archaeology department. In those days, that's how it worked. And then, if he wasn't already well known enough, he goes down to Mexico in 1922, and he actually discovers, with another Mexican archaeologist, the Cuicuilco pyramid, which is a very unusual circular pyramid. It's a very massive, huge pyramid outside of Mexico City. This is, here's a museum buildings to give you the idea of the size and scale of this pyramid. He convinced the Mexican government to pay all the laborers to dig it. He got a grant from the National Geographic Society and returned and did major excavations in 24 and 25 and became famous worldwide. So the professor of archaeology at the University of Arizona is now one of the most famous archaeologists in America with almost no training. So serendipity sometimes and being in the right place at the right time pays off. And he went on an actual national lecture circuit. I have a collection of papers from all over the country talking about Cummings' discussions and his famous lantern slides, if you know lantern slides, the old-fashioned huge slides that they used to use. And he was quite well known because of these excavations. His influence, his support of the students, and his ability to be an administrator, because he was also dean of several colleges throughout his career. He was an outstanding administrator, led him to be appointed the president of the University of Arizona in 1927. As far as I know, it's the only time an archaeologist has been hired of a president of a major university in the history of the U.S. Again, it was a scandal. They had fired the president. The governor had fired the president of the university. No one would take the job because it was a national scandal, and they couldn't find anybody, and they turned to him and he said, I'll do it for 2 years. And so for 1927, 1928, he was actually president of the University of Arizona, which was very fortunate for him and for archaeology, because with his newfound power and influence and status, he immediately instituted a number of very important programs. The first was that he wrote the Arizona Antiquity Act of 1927. So the Antiquity Act of today, that we all know protects archaeological ruins on state property in Arizona, was written by him. He wrote every word in it, and it's interesting, he called it an act to prevent the further despoliation of the prehistoric sections of Arizona. He wasn't the greatest writer either, as you can see, but nonetheless, he influenced enough legislatures who he knew well himself, and he was very good friends with the governor. And always, it's good to be friends with the governor. He, of course, immediately assumed control of archaeology. One of the things that Byron Cummings was very irritated about is that most of the archaeology that was going on in Arizona and the Southwest in general was being done by Eastern institutions. Smithsonian Institution in Washington, the Carnegie, the Chicago Field Museum, and a few others, and they were taking all the artifacts they were excavating from Arizona, taking them back east, putting them in the museums, and Cummings felt that the resources of Arizona were being lost, even though they were being professionally excavated. And so he wanted to take complete control of archaeology of Arizona. And with this act, he actually originally included federal and private land in the act, so that if you wanted to do archaeology on anyone's property, no matter who owned it, you'd have to get a permit from him. Now that's control. Many people objected to this, except for the locals, who said, great, now our own guy's in charge, you know, and he can dictate what's going on with these excavations, and he immediately informed all these Eastern institutions, if you're going to do archaeology in Arizona, you have to leave half of the collection here in Arizona. Which, believe it or not, the Eastern institutions were outraged over, which if you think is pretty fair compromise, actually you only have to give half to the state. I will point out that as soon as the legislature got the act, they struck private property. And even to this day, private property is not in the State Antiquities Act. But Cummings tried to get control of private property. And of course, the federal property, the state legislature being states' rights individuals, as Governor Hunt was, said, we'll leave it in there. So the act passed with the federal requirements, the federal land being part of the act, and then a federal judge ruled it was unconstitutional, that the state cannot control federal property, so he lost control of archaeology on federal land as well. But at least for state land, he had maintained his control. Then the next step he did is he established an archaeology graduate program. And by the way, the original Department of Anthropology wasn't called the Department of Anthropology at the University of Arizona. It was called the Department of Archaeology. It wasn't until much later that it was changed, and that was by his student, Emil Howry. A lot of people are not aware of that. And so you could get a degree in archaeology now, one of the few in the western United States, at the University of Arizona. It became a very attractive institution for those people that wanted to advance their careers in archaeology. And in fact, the student that helped him excavate Cuicuilco was Emil Howry. Emil Howry's first archaeology job was in 1925 excavating the Cuicuilco pyramid with Cummings. And he became very fond of Cummings and decided that he would go to grad school under Cummings, and immediately got his his master's degree working on HOCOM sites, although they didn't call them the HOCOM at that time. They called them the red on buff culture. It wasn't until the 30s that they decided to start calling them the HOCOM. And Howie's thesis then was the first thesis produced out of this new graduate program that Cummings had established. And that's actually a photograph of one of the late Classic period compounds that were excavated by Cummings graduate students and then written up by Howie. Now, in 1926, Jesse Walter Fuchs, representing the Smithsonian Institution, came out and excavated Eldon Pueblo and took back several hundred vessels from the excavations back east. And that just infuriated Cummings, as you can imagine, since he'd been trying to get control. And of course, they just thumbed his nose at him back east. And so he said, well, I need to have a presence up north then. So he set up the field school at the Turkey Hill Ruin, which is just outside of Flagstaff, to show the Eastern institutions that, by God, they can do archaeology in northern Arizona just as good as they were. Unfortunately, it wasn't as good as they were, but he trained a lot of archaeologists. There was collections. We do have notes. That was never written up, which is unfortunately one of the weaknesses of Cummings. He loved to explore, he loved to dig, he loved to give lectures, he loved to promote and protect archaeology, but he didn't really like to write reports. It's not unusual for the time, but it is something that people now look back on and say, gee, that's really too bad that he didn't do that. He recognized that, though, so he started having his graduate students write as many reports as he could on the excavations that they were doing. He then moved to Kinishba, which is the Brown House, located near Fort Apache. It was under the control of the BIA. He convinced them that he was going to hold a long-term University of Arizona field school there. He would excavate the entire Pueblo. It's a huge Pueblo. He excavated more than 200 rooms during those 5 years with his graduate students and any other people that wanted to come and join him during the summer. He restored a lot of the rooms. This is complete restoration here by Cummings and his students, including 2-story restorations. In fact, here's even a 3-story room. All of this has since fallen down because his knowledge of restoration wasn't very advanced. They had problems with roofs, leaking. It's been a nightmare for them to manage, but it looked beautiful for a while and attracted a lot of attention. And it made him realize that with his graduate students, he could do major excavations and he could then restore the ruins and they could become part of an effort to promote tourism in Arizona. Because many individuals, especially during the Great Depression, recognized that tourism was going to be a way to not only create employment, but also to bring people into the state. And so there was a big move by a lot of influential people to support Cummings in all of his efforts. This project is, well, it's kind of a failure, but nonetheless it was very interesting. And they are re-restoring again Kinishba as we speak. And then the Prescott region became very attractive to archaeologists. Very little was known of the Verde Valley and Prescott region. There was some work being done by Harold Gladwin out of the Gila Pueblo Institute outside of Florence. He was a private millionaire that decided to just become an archaeologist, again with no training whatsoever. But he had lots of money and he was willing to hire archaeologists. And he actually sent out Frank Midvale, a local Phoenician, to explore a lot of the Verde Valley. That attracted attention, and the famous Harvard-trained archaeologist Alfred Kidder decided that he would institute his next major excavation program in the Prescott region, brought his wife Madeline out to tour this area, look at some sites. Cummings found out about this, became infuriated again. There's no way was he going to allow another Eastern archaeologist to come out and dig and take over an area that essentially had previously had very little systematic excavations. And so they got in a fight, and Kidder vowed, that's it, I'll never dig in Arizona again, which was fine with Cummings. Created quite a scandal back east, but what it did was it put the Eastern institutions on notice that if you're coming to Arizona to dig, you're going to have to deal with Cummings, and you better make him happy. And so essentially most of the Eastern institutions went elsewhere from then on. They just decided, okay, we'll go to another state, which is exactly what Cummings wanted. So he won that battle. Cummings was also unhappy that had been Earl Morris, again with the Smithsonian Institution, that had come out and had excavated the famous Verde salt mines in 1926. And all those materials, again, are back in Washington. So he has lots of examples of the materials leaving the state. And finally, with his Antiquities Act of 1927, being president of the university, establishing a graduate program, he pretty much had taken control of Arizona archaeology for the most part. And then the Great Depression started to have a big impact on Yavapai County. And it was especially problematic in Yavapai County because the copper prices had dropped so low that they shut most of the copper mines down. Hundreds of people were put out of work. And Yavapai County did not really have any other developed industry, and they were really hurting for work. They were very fortunate. There was a remarkable, energetic, socially connected individual, Grace Sparks, who was the secretary of the Yavapai County Chamber of Commerce, who promoted archaeology as a job creator and as a tourism developer, as an attraction. And she was one of the movers and shakers of the region. In fact, she was one of the ones that helped create the Smoke Eye Club. Those are the group of Anglos who dressed up like Hopis and did snake dances and other activities. Today considered very outrageous that they did that, but it brought tourists in. And so this is actually Grace meeting with President Calvin Coolidge in the mid-1920s, giving him an Arizona Stetson hat as a gift and making him an honorary member of the Smoke Eye. Did you know President Coolidge was actually a member of our own Smoke Eye organization? And of course, Cummings befriended her. They were similar in their mindset. And Cummings formed the Yavapai Archaeological Committee in 1932. The Great Depression really hit hard in 32 in central Arizona. And associated with the Chamber of Commerce because of Grace's remarkable abilities. And then the Smoke Eye Museum was built so it could be the repository for archaeological materials of the region. And then he decided to have a systematic excavation program by his graduate students in the Prescott and Verde Valley region. The first thing he did is he sent his graduate student, Edward Spicer, to excavate the King's Ruin in Chino Valley, north of Prescott. Edward Spicer had received his bachelor's degree in economics at the University of Arizona and decided that was boring and archaeology was more interesting, so when Cummings offered him this job, he took it. He then got his master's from Cummings the next year. Boy, it only took a year to get a master's degree back then. That's remarkable. Now you're lucky if you can get it in 5, you know. But times were different back then. So Spicer did the excavation, wrote a small little report on, and it really attracted interest because of what they found. And then, of course, another of Cummings' graduate student was Earl Jackson. And Earl Jackson was assigned to survey the Verde River region for his master's thesis with Cumming. What's interesting about Earl Jackson, and this tall, lanky ranger here is actually Earl Jackson, showing a visitor, Montezuma's Castle, is that he was actually the son of the custodian of Montezuma's Castle, Martin Jackson, and had been hired by the Park Service in 1925 at the age of 15 to help with stabilization. So he had an extensive background in archaeology and stabilization, and in fact, he then excavated Montezuma Castle in 1933 and 34 with Van Valkenburg. But again, it was a Cummings graduate student generated from this graduate program that he had established. So then there's another ruin that he wanted to dig outside of Prescott, the Fitzmaurice ruin on private property, much like the King's ruin was. And so he sent Lewis Caywood. Lewis Caywood was actually born in Bisbee, a nice Arizona connection. He had a business degree, 1932 in Arizona, again found that boring, and so he decided to become an archaeologist. Had his master's degree in archaeology within a year under Cummings, and then later had a long career with the National Park Service. And then Cummings said, we need to dig a site in the Upper Verde area. There's never been any excavations. That's my next target area. I have some graduate students in mind. He asked Earl Jackson. Earl Jackson said, I recommend a ruin on a ridgetop near Clarkdale, which, by the way, was not called Tuzigoot at that time. It was unnamed. Tuzigoot was added later. It's a Tonto Apache word for crooked water, Pecks Lake. And it was privately owned, actually commercially owned, I should say, by the United Verde Copper Company. Cummings had an amazing ability to talk to anybody and get them interested in archaeology and support his efforts, and the copper company said, yes, we'll give you permission to excavate there, and we'll even provide you technical assistance, use of our labs, some of our engineers, do it. And so Cummings assigned two of his graduate students that had been working in this region, Edward Spicer and Lewis Caywood, to take charge of excavations at Tuzigoot. I should mention, I already told you that Caywood went on to a long career in the Park Service as an archaeologist and ranger after this work. But Edward Spicer actually had an even more illustrious career. He ended up, after this excavation, going to the University of Chicago and getting his doctorate there in cultural anthropology. He did a famous series of studies with the Yaqui Indians and wrote a book that is still in print that's a classic book called Cycles of Conquest. And so two of Cummings graduate students that excavated in this region both had illustrious careers, so I would say that's a pretty successful graduate program when you can see how his students are going on and getting really good jobs. So how do you get the money? Well, the government is looking for projects to hire people, and so working with Grace Sparks, who had a big influence on the projects selected for federal work money, worked with Cummings, and they said, yes, Tuzigoot is a great site to dig. And so they offered originally to use federal emergency relief money, only enough to hire 8 men, and then after 1 month, money was gone. Because the program became a national debate and it got shut down. President Roosevelt then said, well, I'll create other work programs. And so the Civil Works Administration program became an opportunity to pay for 48 workmen and several women to do the excavations of Tuzigoot for a year, essentially for a whole year. And then, in fact, Grace got some additional money to pay for analysis and write-up through the next year. So a huge amount of money for the time. And the project was put under Lewis Caywood's direction. Lewis was a very handsome, tall individual, was well-liked, and seemed to be the ideal person. So what were the project goals in 1933 to excavate a large Sinagua Pueblo site? Well, excavate as much of it as you can. The reason being, because they want to restore it, to make it into a major tourist attraction. So you have to preserve it. They rebuilt walls. They actually put roofs on many of the rooms, which later had to be torn down because they were poorly built. In fact, many of the walls they rebuilt had to be rebuilt later, as early as the 40s even, actually. And to display all the artifacts that had been recovered in a museum. Well, there were no museums in that area. The closest one would be the Smoky. So Cummings got the idea, well, we'll build a museum right next to the site. Well, one of the problems with the building of that museum is that it didn't really qualify for federal funds, so we found a very clever way to do that, and I'll talk about that in a minute. This is the original 1934 excavation map. In their report, Caywood and Spencer authored. There were 2 other graduate students, by the way, that Cummings also sent up. So there are 4 of his graduate students, Harry Getty and Gordon Baldwin, who also got their master's degrees at U of A, assisted them. So they had 4 graduate students supervising a crew of 48 people that had absolutely no experience in archaeology. Because they were just people off the street that needed work. And they were happy to do it. And so you have 4 graduate students, so they provided the in-field training and they just went to work. They excavated 86 rooms out of 110 total that they counted, so it was pretty close to complete excavation. They actually excavated 411 human burials, which is a very sizable burial population for collecting data on at that time. Unfortunately, some of the excavation techniques are either unknown or probably were not to the standards that we would feel comfortable with today. They divided the ruin into 6 different groups, only for management purposes, and then gave numbers to each of the ruins within each arbitrary unit rather than completely sequentially. So if you try to make sense of the notes today, it's very confusing. But nonetheless, they also dug trenches 3 feet apart. This is extremely close intervals, closer intervals than we would dig today. We would never dig a trench more than 5 feet apart today. But they dug a whole series of trenches all up and down the slopes, 3 feet apart, and that's where a good portion of the burials were found. In the midden area, down the slopes from the Pueblos, and some of those midden areas were very deep. In one place, they found 11 feet of midden deposits. If you can imagine trash that's 11 feet deep. This is a major occupation for 300 or 400 years, and so it generated a large amount of trash, and it provided a lot of artifacts and a lot of burials because of that. They set up a laboratory, which they called the Pottery Mending Project, because they were finding so many vessels. And so these are all vessels here that are in one stage or another of being reconstructed and inventoried from Tuzigoot. This is actually Caywood right here, tall, handsome guy, surrounded by beautiful women. What a job. Working on the lab. This was actually at a former water store that they converted into the lab. And I noticed that there actually is 2 other men in the back, but primarily it was a women's job to work in the lab back then. They didn't really want them working at the site. That was considered bad luck. Where would that come from? Well, you know, in the old days, it was bad luck to have a woman work in a mine, so it kind of went over into archaeology in Arizona. That changed quickly, of course. So the women got to do all the fun work on the artifacts. And the excavation was left to the men, and they went to town. This is a staged photo, I'm sure. But if you have 48 people working at the site, that's a very large crew. Even by today's standards, that's a huge, huge crew of archaeologists, or I should say street people who temporarily had become archaeologists. And they were hard workers, and they were under the direction of the 4 graduate students. And so for the time, they did a pretty good job, actually, for the 1930s. And the excavations themselves started at the base of the ruins and then went all the way to the very top of the ridge. And in 1976, Dana Hartman did an analysis of the field notes to see exactly what was known about the site and to evaluate its condition and also to determine exactly how much excavation had been done. And interestingly, she found that indeed there were a number of rooms that you can see when you walk out there onto the property that were not fully excavated. So there are still intact deposits in some of those rooms that look like they're all empty. Only the black rooms were completely excavated. All of these rooms with slashes have existing archaeological deposits still in the rooms today. So there is still archaeology at that site. It's unlikely it ever will be dug because it's preserved now, but it's good to know that it wasn't completely stripped of everything. Maybe some target-specific research questions in the future could be addressed by some strategic excavations. She also found, unfortunately, that there was about 17 rooms where there are no field notes. So we have no idea what went on in those rooms. And that's probably just because you had all those inexperienced people. And if you can imagine, even with 4 graduate students, keeping track of 48 workers, that's more than 10 workers under each person. That's very difficult to manage. And I'm sure that the notes got away from them on a few occasions. But nonetheless, there still is a considerable amount of information available still. Now, when Cummings found out that the federal work programs would not finance the building of a museum, he very cleverly called it an annex, which somehow that qualified for federal funds. So he just called the museum the Annex. Annex to what? I don't know, because there were no buildings there. An annex to the prehistoric building, of course. And so therefore he got federal money, and he built the museum, that part of the museum that you see today. Here's the actual construction. of that annex. And you can see that they tried to make it similar to the prehistoric site by using the local stone, timbers for roofs. I love this photo because look at the old Model T cars down here. Great set of old cars. Those old cars, by the way, were like four-wheel drives, I've heard. They could go anywhere. I mean, they were remarkable in what they could do. They made a very good archaeology. This is a recent picture I took where you can see the so-called annex is up to the northern end, beyond the last part of the Pueblo, of this portion of the site. And it's such a beautiful setting, this site. It's just gorgeous. And you can see some of the walls that this crew's reconstructed and then were reconstructed again later. Okay, so what can we say about this project? Well, they wrote a 119-page report in 1 year, which is actually remarkable and was unprecedented for the time. And in fact, many of the federal work projects either never had a report or it took them years and years, even decades, to get reports produced. They produced a report in 1 year. So whatever criticism you have of that report, keep in mind, it was done at really an unprecedented schedule. They moved 5,000 cubic yards of earth. Any of you have an idea how much dirt that is? That is a lot of dirt. Yeah. That's a lot of dirt. They reconstructed 20,000 cubic yards of masonry. Again, people off the street, now they're masons. First they're archaeologists, now they're masons. Can you move some rock, put some mortar? All right, you're a mason. That's probably why it had to be rebuilt later on, because you have amateurs. Amateurs in the truest sense of the word. They put 34,065 person hours into that project. Huge effort. Even to this day, there has never been a project of this scale in the Upper Verde region. And the federal government spent $27,575, which doesn't sound like much. This 1934 money would be the equivalent of over $400,000 today with inflation. And you know what? That's cheap. To dig the site like they dug then would cost at least $1 million, maybe $2 million in today's monies. I guarantee you. I know that because I dealt with a lot of budgets. And so they got a lot of work done for the money that they even got. Of course, part of it is workers weren't paid much. They paid pretty much minimum wage from the government scale. But it does show you they accomplished a huge amount of work for what they did. All right, so what did they learn? Well, first of all, that it was a rambling masonry pueblo of limestone and sandstone that had very little planning and was essentially just expanded through time as needed. It wasn't like it was all built at once like some pueblos, or there was some genius out there saying this is what it's going to look like. It was more of an expeditious, what do we need? Let's build it. The walls were actually plastered, all plastered, with a red colored clay that they had put sand in. That shows you that even though they weren't the best architects, the Sinawa, they understood that if you add sand to your plaster, it just makes it last and adhere to the walls better. It was mostly local wood, juniper and sycamore. They were not willing to go to the effort that some of the Pueblo ruins, the famous Pueblo ruins today, and do these marches and bring back big pine timbers. They just didn't feel the need to do that, which was a slight detriment to dating the site at the time because they had very few species that could be dated with tree ring datings in the 30s, because pine was the primary tree species that could be dated that way. There were 15 two-story rooms. One of them may have been a three-story room. That's quite a sizable number of upper-story rooms. There were at least 3 major building episodes. They estimated, they didn't have any real good dates. Keep in mind, this is before carbon-14 dating was invented. Carbon-14 dating wasn't really in use until the 50s in the Southwest, and so this is way before that. So for the methods that they had, they did the best they could to date it. And in fact, a lot of it was through superpositioning and looking at the trash, because a lot of when they expanded, a lot of times they would actually expand the pueblos on top of trash units. So they could see the pottery types are underneath the floors, and they know that they would have to post-date those periods. One of the things before I go into the entryways is that they were not very good masons, the Sanawa, at least for this site. They did very little joining of corners. It was just a lot of stone on stone. They didn't think about how to stabilize the walls in a long-term way, although there were big boulders that they often would put at the base and then build up. And for the upper story rooms, the two-story rooms, they would build double walls in the bottom, so they would have a good foundation and not collapse. So they understood architecture, but they were not outstanding masons. The entryways were interesting because all of the entryways were through the roof. You have 110 rooms, and the only way you can get to any of the rooms is through the roof and a ladder. It's a very interesting phenomenon. Why is the question. Well, it provides a certain sense of security. If the pueblo is ever attacked, it's going to be hard. You got to get up on the roof. You know, you expose yourself. It's easy to defend that way. It also creates privacy. You don't have kids running into your room when you don't want them running in there, or neighbors visiting when you don't want to visit them. I mean, there's a certain sense of inclusiveness that is present when you have this kind of architecture. But I just find it amazing that they're all rooftop entries, with 4 exceptions. And those were just rooms that were connected with doorways. I've got 4 examples on this map here for you. This one was a 2-story that actually opened out probably to the roof of this one. These 2 open to each other, these 2 to each other, and then these 2 to each other. That's it. Those are the only vertical doorways in the entire pueblo. They found a lot of floor features. In fact, they did probably their best architectural work was on examining floor features, which are very informative. They typically had 2 support roof for the beam, for the roofs. I've colored these 2 in, so those would be the roof supports here. You have a hearth that's in the middle. Early on, they had circular hearths, and then later on, they went to slab hearths. Here's a photo out of their report that shows you that the slab line hearths are considerably different than a circular hearth. They don't really have an explanation for that change. And then there were 2 rooms with unusual post holes that were not for roof support. They did try to explain what they are, but I believe they were probably altars or looms for weaving. For example, this room here, the only map of a room showing the roof supports. Their maps in the reports are minimal. It's very frustrating when you've got 5 maps of a site that was excavated of the scale that I'm talking about. It's frustrating as hell, especially when they start talking about artifacts and they don't even tell you what rooms the artifacts were from. But these are very interesting, these 2 holes. Okay. Not unusual, but very interesting, was that there were 9 rooms that have big oyas or jars that were put into the floor, and the opening of the jars was flush with the floor, and many of them then had a circular stone slab that was put on top of it to seal it. Could have been for water, so you would have water in your room, you know, whenever you need it, not have to run down to the river to get water. Or you could store food in there too. And some of the oyas actually still had twined basketry rests on the bottom of them, the vessels, excuse me, which is very interesting that there was that kind of preservation. These big oyas were typically Verde brown ware. They're all plain ware, very utilitarian. They're not even well formed. They're lopsided. They're basically just functional. And in fact, the analyzers of the pottery, of the local pottery, said or implied that the pottery was nothing to get too excited about, but at least it was better than the Prescott pottery. That the excavators who had excavated in the Prescott said it was the worst pottery they'd ever seen in their life, the Prescott pottery. So that was an improvement over the Prescott people anyway. And by the way, that was one of the interesting things. They were looking to see if this was a Prescott site, a Prescott culture site, called Prescott Black-on-Grey culture peoples at that time after the pottery, and they found that that was not the case. They also found 5 rooms with formal depressions in the middle that they could not explain. And here's the dividers, an example, one of the 5 maps that I was talking about. But you can see a nice cross-section. It shows you how it's depressed. Here's the fire pit, and then there's the rest of the room. And they said, well, catching rainwater was the only thing they could think of. And of course, my response, well, why only 5 out of 110 rooms then? So there's probably something more going on there. But what? Who knows? Okay, let's look at some of the materials. Fortunately, the Tuzigoot has a museum, has a fabulous collection of artifacts, and so I went there and took photos so you could see some of the materials I want to talk about. The woven mats were well made. They were found on floors and roofs. And it makes sense on the roof because it would help seal the roof when you wanted to put all the layers, because the roofs were, you know, the poles, and then logs, and then twigs, and then grass, and then mud. So you might have a roof that's that thick, and this would help, underneath it would help secure all the materials that you're putting in. Here's an artist's reconstruction of the Pueblo, and it does show a feature that has been suggested as a plaza. Between this group of rooms and the northernmost group, there is an open space here. It's been suggested that was probably for religious ceremonies, for dances, other kinds of ritual activities, because there are no kivas that have been found at this site, which is not unusual. Kivas are not common for this region. But nonetheless, when you have a pueblo of this size, you know there's got to be religious facilities that are associated with it. So the question, if there's no kivas, what rooms then were serving similar functions? And there may be one room that was the equivalent of a kiva. There are a whole series of special rooms that were found. I've illustrated some of them for you. Number 4 in group 4 here had an elevated floor slab that was embedded in clay, probably an altar of some kind. There were 2 rooms that had wall niches 1 to 2 feet deep. So pretty deep and big niches set into the wall. Clearly a formal architecture. A unit, probably again a shrine of some kind to place objects. And those 2 rooms are right here, 2 and 6 of group 3. There were subfloor caches of valuable materials in some of the floors. In room 2, there was a hole with obsidian chert and chalcedony flakes, a substantial number. In room 26 of group 5, there was a small hole that had pieces of azurite and malachite. And my experience is that that's usually some kind of offering to the when you construct a room. It's like a blessing to ensure good things happen in that room. And then a really unusual feature in my mind, because there's only one at the entire site, and it's in a room, and that is a big roasting feature inside a room. It was lined with boulders, and it was 2 feet in diameter, about 1 foot deep, and it was a very burnt roasting pit. And what's really interesting too is that it was down here at the very southern end of the Pueblo in number 1. There's no explanation for that, but again, it could be related to some kind of ritual ceremonial activities down there. And of course, there was the room at the very top, room 14, which has been, which they called a ceremonial room, and even Peter Pillis has suggested, the Coconino National Forest archaeologist, that it was probably the equivalent of a kiva. So they may have had at least one room that was the equivalent of a kiva. Why? I'll explain that in a minute. But I do want to point out that the 2 rooms that had the loom holes or the unusual holes in the floor are these 2 rooms here. And they're early rooms. So there was some kind of activity early in the history of the site that was then not repeated later on, or at least was not recognized by the archaeologists. Okay, here's the ceremonial room. A number of unusual things about this room. First of all, there was a divider room, very thin, so it wasn't very architecturally sound. And in the middle of the room were actually 2 posts, wall. There were 2 posts that were part of the wall. Very unique to the site. And they called it a partition wall. There was a raised platform. This is actually a raised platform with a bunch of clay and small stones that looks like it's probably an altar or a bench. There was no fire pit, so it was not a living room or a domestic use room. There were 7 infants and children buried under the floor of this room, and there were 3 burials are actually underneath this raised platform itself. So this is a very unique, very special room, and I think clearly has ceremonial functions. And I think most archaeologists would agree with that. But why only one? I mean, for other Pueblo sites, you have 110 rooms and you're going to get multiple kivas. So something going on here that we don't quite understand about Sanaa religion yet. Groundstone tools, a ton of them. Of course, if you're an agriculturalist, you need to process your corn, and they found corn. Surprisingly, not as much as you would think, but I think that might be their excavation techniques. They did do some screening. We don't know how much. There's no discussion of what got screened and what did not get screened. But they did do some screening because there's occasional mentions to it. But they did find corn kernels, and what they did find a lot of was the clay plugs that they put into storage jars had corn cob impressions under the bottom of the clay plug. So they were jamming corn cobs or shucking the corn, putting the kernels in the jars, taking wet clay, sealing them, and then the impression of the cobs or the kernels got on the bottom of the clay. There's a lot of that, so very good indirect evidence of a lot of corn. They found masses of beans, burnt beans, big chunks of them, so they know beans were very popular there. And what's interesting is that of all the metates, they're all trough metates. 120 trough metates, which is a sizable number. In fact, you could probably say that represents 120 families, because each family would have one trough. They're extremely valuable implements. They take a considerable amount of time to make a trough metate, all the shaping, because it's formed in such a formal way. As you can see here, with this trough metate here, made out of vesicular basalt. 615 monos, again, a lot of monos. 9 mortars and 16 pestles, so a lot of groundstone. So clearly they're processing a lot of food products. 127 stone axes that were at one time hafted, and the axes would probably been just as valuable as the metate. In fact, I would suggest your axe and your metate are your 2 most valuable tools that you would find at a site, because both of them take so much time to make. And in fact, that's evident with the axes, and they even comment on that they would reuse the axes as they got dull. They would resharpen them until they were just nubs, and then they would make them into mauls. So once you hafted an axe, until there was nothing left of it, you used it and used it and used it, because they were so valuable. There were a lot of air shaft straighteners, 26, which suggests either they were doing a lot of hunting or they were prepared for war, or both. But it does, again, indicate they were well armed. That's a lot of shaft straighteners. And in fact, they actually did find a complete bow in one of the child burials of all the places to find it. And it was a miniature bow. It was a little bit less than 3 foot in length, and there was even a partial arrow shaft. Why would a child have a miniature bow? It's train them. Maybe the father said, you're going to be a hunter and we're going to start you young. And we'll give you a bow that fits your size, and then as you get older, we'll give you a regular bow. The pottery was both locally made and imported. There was a lot of pottery, a huge amount of pottery, especially you imagine all those burials. Of considerable variety. The Caywood and Spicer argue that most of the planewares were locally made. In fact, they even created some new names. Tuzigoot Red was very popular, but the imported pottery was brought in primarily for ritual use and for burials. Because when you want to bury somebody, you want to give them something really nice to take away with them to the next world. There's 37 different types of decorated pottery that was identified then. Who knows today, if we were to relook at the pottery, how many types that we would have. But that's a large variety, a wide variety of types. And of course, they were interested in where they came from, because they were trying to figure out, who are these people? Are these Hokan people? Are these Prescott people? Or are these northern Pueblo people? And their pottery analysis indicated none. These are unique people to the Verde Valley. They're their own people. which was a major contribution to archaeology at that time, because everybody that was working in archaeology in Arizona either wanted to make them Hohokam or Northern Puebloan. And they said, no, these are their own people. This is the Sinawa people. And of course, the term Sinawa wasn't in use until a little bit later, but there was clearly that it was not Northern Pueblo people that came in. There's some other reasons why they argued that as well. There was a very good representation of ancestral Hopi yellowware. A beautiful, beautiful pottery. Considered some of the finest pottery ever made in the Southwest. Very hard fired, almost porcelain-like because they used coal to burn it. Intense heats. It made a really hard pot. It didn't break easily. It was attractive, the clay color, and so people all over the Southwest tried to get their hands on the ancestral Hopi pottery whenever they could, and the designs are usually very interesting in that, here's a quote from their book. They said, the design seems as though that each might tell a story. And of course the rest of that line is, if only we could interpret it. Yeah. But they knew that there were stories being told. And today I would suggest that we probably could at least rough out some of the parts of those stories, since we know a lot more about Hopi oral traditions and symbols and art. I will point out, this pot here, I believe these are macaws. See these two macaws here? They did find macaw bones at the site. There were macaws that were at the site. Unfortunately, in the report, it says macaws were found, period. Not how many or where, which is really unfortunate. But at least we know they were present. They did have Prescott Black-on-Grey pottery as they anticipated, but it only represented 11% of the pottery, which convinced the excavators this was not a Prescott Black-on-Grey culture site. In fact, it helped determine that the Prescott boundary was probably to the west of Tuzigoot. I find this pot interesting because it looks like sun symbols to me. Quite a difference in the Prescott pottery and the ancestral Hopi pottery, right? Again, this is the funky pottery that they complained about. And just looking at that, you can see how it's pretty simple. It worked, and that was probably all they were worried about. There were not artists that were working on Prescott Black-on-Grey pottery. They found excellent examples of salt from the Verde salt mine. In fact, we now know that the salt that they got out of the Verde salt mine, which was not that far of a distance, an easy walk, a few hours walk from the Pueblo, was traded all over the Southwest. In fact, it might have been the salt was traded for those Hopi vessels that we saw, ancestral Hopi vessels. Because it was a very important part of the diet, and it's very hard to find. And this salt mine is a very unique phenomenon and produces high quality salt. I mean, look at this rock salt. This is just fantastic salt. And I imagine that the potters were more than willing to trade their pots to get their hands on some of this salt. There were a lot of clay figurines, and they did determine the clay figurines were not like the Hohokam, who are famous for figurines, but more like Prescott figurines. So there was a Prescott connection. There's clearly trade going on with the Prescott region, but they were not Prescott people. They know that it was the Prescott because of the pinched nose, is a classic trait of figurines from that area. There was also exaggerated applied female breasts to some of the figurines. I say exaggerated only because they do seem a little out of proportion here. But then again, you know, if a man made this, you know, maybe that was a wish, you know. Or a statement about his wife, who knows, you know. But it's very interesting. They made the breasts separate and then applied them to the torso instead of molding them out of the body itself, which may have a certain symbolic statement in its own right. There are also a large number of animal figurines. Very simple and crude, though. Nothing to get excited about, but they were present. A lot of spindle whorls for weaving textiles, and They very likely were excellent weavers. I talked about the possible loom holes, post holes. There are two basic kinds of pottery. Spindle whorls, you have just old vessels that were broken, and then they would grind them down to a circle and then drill a hole in it and put a stick through it, and then that's how you would create your fibers, your threads, that then you would use to weave, or they would actually mold clay itself into the forms. And what's interesting is a lot of times the molded forms take on kind of unusual shapes, like these would be called pulley forms here, and there was some other kinds too. Why you would have two different kinds of spindle whorls, it's been suggested different kinds of textiles. So one you might use for, say, cotton, another you might use for agave fibers. It's a guess, but why otherwise do you need different kinds of spindle whorls? There were some beautiful bone awls, deer, leg bones, of course, and they did mention that there was a couple of them that had carved heads to them, but most of them are just very simple. Critical tool for making basketry and for leather work. Again, showing that there was a fair amount of craft production that was going on at the site. Notice how polished some of those are. And that polish would be from use. A lot of use. Your basketry materials are going to be plants that have high silicone content. So the little silicone, the little, essentially little micro pieces of quartz that's in your plant, when you use the bone, it polishes the bone. And so you get this high sheen on that from considerable use. A lot of turquoise and shell jewelry. In fact, the excavators commented on how much and how beautiful the shell jewelry was. And although they were not really excited about the artistic talents of the Sinawa at Tuzigoot, they really were impressed with the jewelry. Of course, it could be that a lot of it was imported and they didn't make it. But we do have evidence they probably were working on some of it at the site. The turquoise pendants were very attractive. There were bracelets, necklaces, there were mosaics. And what's interesting is that turquoise was found with all ages, including the very youngest. So clearly, turquoise was more than a functional or aesthetic item. It probably had some kind of symbolism and maybe even some importance in rituals. And every individual, regardless of your age, remember this because later on it's going to be in contrast to some other things I say. And of course, carved shell, a lot of bracelets, armlets, and that shell had to be imported, of course, because it's marine shell. And there were 13 different species of marine shell. It's a pretty sizable range of different kinds of species. So we have all kinds of, jewelry made out of that, tinklers, rings, the bracelets and the armbands I talked about, beads, pendants, although less so for pendants, because often they would prefer stone. There were a lot of pendants, and in fact, they found 20 different strings of beads, which is extremely difficult to make, hand make those strings of beads because they all have to be ground down. Look at the size of these beads here. Each one of those is hand ground. Now, they don't grind beads individually, though. Does anyone have an idea how you would grind beads? You would get blanks, you would drill a hole, you'd string them, and then you grind them all together. So that way you get them uniform in size and shape, and you can do massive numbers of beads at one time rather than do an individual bead. You can imagine the work on, they were smart enough to be efficient in that regard. But there was one medicine man that had a string of 161 turquoise pendants interspersed between 805 black stone beads, which is nothing compared to what I'm going to talk about in a minute. Here was a cache that had 652 argillite workpieces. So these are being ready to be made into beads. And so you can see this is how they would get them to a little square. And they were either square or six-sided. And then they would drill the hole and then they would string them and then grind them. Unless they were going to use them for mosaics, because they also used argillite for mosaics as part of shell jewelry that had mosaic. The Chino mines produce some of the best quality argillite in this region, and it's very likely that's where it came from, although I'd be curious to look at the literature and see if anyone's actually tried to source this. Kathy, do you know if anyone's ever tried to really source this material?
I don't know.
Yeah. Sorry to put you on the spot there. Okay. That's it. Besides, you're retired now. You don't have to answer those questions anymore, right? They found 429 people, which is quite a few out of those 411 burials. So what did they have to say? Well, let's go over a few of the things. It's kind of interesting. Primarily extended inhumation. In other words, they buried them in a long pit just like we bury people today. With the head oriented to the north if you're male, and to the south if you're female. That's a very interesting pattern. There were some exceptions to that, but the majority for each direction, that's definitely symbolic there. Which is interesting because in the Holcomb area, the vast majority of burials are oriented to the east, heads to the east. The excavators said the reason they were north and south because that's the direction of the ridge. I think there's more going on there than direction of the ridge. You can orient your body any way you want, and I think that it's interesting that you get north and south. Although, you know, perhaps in the midden it's sloped, you know, it is going in the north-south direction. Maybe there was a functional reason for that. If that's the case, why do the different gender have different directions then? Graves were covered with wooden poles, but mostly just the adults. So they would actually prepare poles and then cover the top before they buried them over. So the person would actually be sort of in a little cavity if they could see, and maybe they are in the other life, they would probably argue that they are. They would be looking up at all these poles. Except for children, which had stone slab coverings, which is a very interesting difference. There were 8 individuals that had blue and green face painting. So it was probably part of the death ritual where they painted the faces blue and green. Guess where that came from? Your azurite and your malachite, of course. There were some individuals who were wrapped in twined mats. There was one child that had a twined mat that the mat had been colored with red from hematite. Interestingly, the younger individuals, those under 12 years of age, were buried under the floors of rooms, often near the east walls. So there is some kind of east symbolism going on there, but it's only with the child burials. Almost all of the people, with a few exceptions, over the age of 12 got buried in the midden or in the refuge areas. They didn't have any suggestions for this, but in my reading of other literature, the reason that the really young individuals were buried under the rooms could well be that they weren't spiritually fully developed yet, and they needed to be protected by their family, and the best way to protect them is to have them under your feet in your room. The author suggested that it could be because they weren't yet initiated into the religious sodalities. And if you weren't initiated into a religious sodality, you could not get the same kind of burial ceremony process that goes with being buried in the midden. And I think that's a pretty good explanation. There was only pottery in 30% of the burials. I think there's a misperception that everybody gets pottery. That's less than a third of the people are getting pottery of any kind in their burials. And there's very few individuals that got more than a handful of pots, which may not seem unusual, but when you go to other well-developed agricultural peoples in the United States, like back east, they get huge quantities of pottery if they're people of high status. Apparently for the Sinawa, in fact, it's true for a lot of the prehistoric peoples of the Southwest, high statuses were not reflected in the amount of pots that you had when you were buried. Adults had more grave offerings than younger individuals, with a few notable exceptions. And they suggest, which is, I think was probably a good suggestion, that those children that had the high number of grave goods were probably members of ranked families. In other words, they had status just by merely being born into that family. But the majority of the other children, when they're buried, they didn't get very much. It's, bless them, take care of them after they're dead, but you don't leave a lot of materials with them in the grave. And if they're not considered fully developed individuals, they're not going to need materials in the afterlife. Okay, there was one burial that was spectacular, absolutely spectacular in the goods that were put into, and by the way, I don't like the word goods, offerings is a much better word. It was an adult burial up in group 1, so up near the top. A string of shell beads 24 feet long around the knees. Does anybody have an idea why you would have all those shell beads around your knee area? The authors had an excellent explanation. They were probably sewn into a garment. And so that would have been the decoration as part of the garment that the person is buried in. There's a string of red and black beads 12 feet long around his neck. I mean, that's a long necklace. Of course, that means you're doubling back on it. But still, imagine the numbers of beads. There was turquoise mosaic frog pendants near each ear and on the chest. This is clearly a priest. There's no question about it. And so it's interesting that it's a religious specialist that has the richest grave goods, which tells you about power in this society, which of course is very similar to Puebloan hierarchies. The priests are very high up in the ladder of authority and status. 13 shell bracelets on the left arm. 13 of them. The amount of work that went into manufacturing those shell bracelets is phenomenal. And to have 13 of them. Unbelievable. Really amazing. And on the left wrist, a string of 2,542 beads, 5 feet in length. It's not enough to have all those shell bracelets, then you've got this incredible string of beads. And on the right wrist, you have 140 turquoise beads and 560 black beads. This person was really decked out. This is a person in all their finery. And 2 Jetado black-on-yellow bowls and 2 plainware pots. That is an exceptional burial. By any standards in the entire Southwest, this is an exceptional burial. Was this the guy in charge of the site? We don't know, but certainly he was a person that had great influence.
And he didn't take a photograph.
What's that?
Photograph.
I don't know. I wouldn't show it to you anyway, because out of courtesy, we don't show photos of human burials in Arizona, okay? So I wasn't in the report, but I wouldn't show it to you anyway, even if I had access to it. Okay, so what did they conclude from this research? Well, they said it's a mixture of cultures. It's not any of the standard cultures that we know. These are their own people. It's sort of a conglomeration of other cultures around them, which I think is very accurate. The architectural plan, which is rooms built around a small open courtyard, is actually similar to other sites in the region. So there is some kind of building plan, even if it is a very simple one, that all the Sonawa, the Verde Valley, especially the upper Verde Valley, were subscribing to when they built their pueblos. The decorated pottery indicates relationships primarily to the west, the Prescott peoples, and then to the north with the northern pueblos. Not to the south, not to the Holcomb. However, when they looked at the lithic assemblage, the flake stone tools and various things, they thought that that reflected Holcomb influence. So your pottery is north and west, and then your stone tools are coming from the south. Their burial practices are very different than the northern Pueblo people. And they argued specifically these are not northern Pueblo people that migrated to the Verde Valley. because if they did, they would be following the same burial practices as where their ancestors did, and they're different. And that is a very good argument that these are not Northern Pueblo people. That alone, plus all the other data, makes it pretty convincing. They suggested there were 450 people living at Tuzigoot at one time. Dana Hartman and Keith Anderson, who reanalyzed the burials and published a report in 1992, says that figure is probably twice too much.
It's too much?
Too much. It's probably half of that. It's probably about 225, 235. And what they did is they based theirs on hearse, contemporary hearse. In other words, they tried to look at the rooms that were built at the same time that had hearse. That represents a family. You extract 5 people per family, and then you get your numbers. So it's a little more sophisticated approach to burial population reconstruction. So it is likely that that is too much. But at least they made an effort, and even 225 people is a pretty sizable population for Pueblo. And then, of course, finally, in July 1939, the site was given the status that both Byron Cummings and Grace Sparks had been seeking, which is National Monument status. Because once it achieved National Monument status, it could clearly be made into a major tourist attraction. So one of the central goals of both Byron Cummings, his graduate students, and Grace Sparks was to excavate the site so it could be developed into a tourist attraction. And in that regard, it was an extreme success. And so that's my talk for today. I'll be glad to take any questions that you have. Yes?
Is that a 30 picture?
That's my picture.
You just took currently?
Current picture.
Today.
No, a couple months ago.
What lithic materials were taken that would say it was from
Some of the projectile points look Holcomb, and they have very unique projectile points, so they're clearly Holcomb. I think that's probably an overstatement. It's really hard to say lithic materials come from one region or another, but the projectile points, yes, certainly. Another question?
I have 3 questions.
3, okay.
Short.
Sure, go ahead.
And you may have mentioned this. What was the period of time that elapsed from the time they excavated this site until they reconstructed it?
They reconstructed it as they were excavating it.
Okay.
So when they left the site in 35, it was reconstructed.
And then,
What the problem was is that it wasn't done very well, and so the Park Service in the 40s had to come back in and redo a lot of the reconstructions. Take out a lot of the roofs that got put in because they weren't working. And so now you go out there, you see all these roofless rooms. That's not how Cummings envisioned it. He wanted to put roofs on it and make it look more like a Pueblo that was in use, but they didn't have the technology or the skill to do that at that time.
and then in reference to the reconstruction, that was in the 30s.
Well, the excavation was in 33 and 34.
What should have been done to stabilize the walls to prevent reconstruction in the 40s?
Well, reconstruction is a very controversial topic, both in the Park Service and in archaeology in general. First of all, should you be reconstructing? Second of all, what materials do you use? So that's a very good question. They just used mortar and concrete. And first of all, those don't mix very well. And second of all, you had unskilled masons doing the work. So I'm not sure that they could have done a better job for the 30s, actually. Even today, when we could try to reconstruct, it's still very difficult. What we're doing, at Park Service has done, other places have done, we did at Pueblo Grande, they put a polymer. It's a liquid plastic into the mortar, and then that secures it so it won't erode. But that's not natural. You don't see it, so a visitor doesn't know that, but those purists that say you should only reconstruct naturally, that would be a problem for you. I will say this, one of the things we don't recognize, when they built this Pueblo, they were repairing it constantly. So a lot of the problems that the Park Service faced in the 40s, the Sinaloa would have faced themselves too. So 5-10 years after they built a room, they're probably in there doing major restoration themselves to it. It's just the nature of stone and adobe in the Southwest. You got to rebuild, rebuild, rebuild.
And then my last question. what have Native American archaeologists contributed toward the archaeology in the Verde Valley?
Well, that's probably not a question that I could answer adequately for you. The Yavapai Apache tribe has an archaeologist. They're very actively involved in preservation and archaeological research. I don't believe they had any Native Americans on their crews, because this was a work program to essentially put...
In present day.
You mean, could you be more specific at what you...
We have Native American archaeologists, and so how have they helped Anglo-archaeology?
Well, with interpretations?
Yes.
Indeed,
Yes.
yeah. With interpreting sites, interpreting features, interpreting artifacts, providing guidance on proper and respectful care of the dead and deceased. That's probably one of the key things, is how do you care for an individual once you take them out of the ground? You know, what kind of sacred blessings need to be performed? How do you wrap the materials? In the state of Arizona, there's a whole set of procedures on the proper way to excavate and care for human remains now, and that's all through consultations with Native Americans. This has been a huge contribution on their part. Yes?
The Pi people and the Apaches were traditional enemies. Is there any evidence that either one of these people were related to the Sonata?
Yes, the Yavapai. Yeah, actually, there's a number of archaeologists and the Yavapai themselves that have suggested, and I think it has merit, that the Yavapai have a connection to the Sonata, an ancestral connection.
But not the Apache?
But not the Apache, no. Yes. Good, all these questions, that's great.
The first time I visited Tuzigoot was in the early 1970s, and at the end of the tour, the guide said, "Look across the valley over there. There's another hill the same size and shape as this, and we're almost sure there's another pueblo under that. But it belongs to a rancher who will not sell us the land and will not let us explore it." Is that true?
Yes, it is true. Well, I don't know about the rancher, but the sites are there, yes, they are.
When you were showing us the Matatis and the Manos, there was almost 6 times the Manos versus the Matatis. Do you know why there was such an incredible amount of Manos versus the hundreds of something?
120 Matatis and 615 Manos is what I said. Well, one for each hand? No, that's a joke. Who knows? Yes, okay. Stuart's an archaeologist. He probably has a good,
One of my things I do is grandstand analysis. You go through monos a lot quicker.
Yeah.
They don't wear out at the same rate.
yeah. And not only that, you, depending whether you're left-handed or right-handed, you wear a mono differently, and so there's a lot of factor in the wear of monos versus the Traf Matati. You're just basically going back and forth. They wear out too. In fact, usually where you see a trough matati is you get a hole in the bottom and it's no longer usable then. But so I think Stuart's explanation is probably the best explanation. Yes, thank you, Stuart. Oh, I'm sorry. I'll get to you next. Yeah.
What happened to Malcolm Cummings when he grew up? What did he do?
What did he do?
Yes.
He went on to be a business person in California. He did not go into archaeology, which is what I tell most parents that archaeologists tell their children, pick another field. If you want to make a living, pick another field. And that's what he did. He did not become an archaeologist, even though he spent all the time with his dad. Yes?
When they finished the site in 1934-35, did it look pretty much like it looks today, or did it look more like Kinishba?
No, it did not look like. Well, it looked more like Kinishba because of the roofs that they had on it, yes. So I'd say it probably did look more like that, yeah. Yes. Here's your question next now.
The burials, as you said, were not similar to the northern Pueblo Indians, so...
The burial practice type,
Right,
yeah.
the burial practice.
As far as I know, they didn't do any physical anthropology. I mean, now we could actually look at different kinds of morphological traits of the skeletal materials, and you could see, and if in the state of Arizona you're allowed to do genetic studies, which we're not, by the way, on burials, then you could really see a connection.
What was those
The way they did it's kind of unique to the Somawa. Yeah, I mean, there's some similarities, obviously, but the exact way was kind of unique to them. I want to, before I get to Jim's question, I want to go back to the burials. One of the things that's interesting is that all the bodies that they dug are still at the site. I see Kathy getting nervous. I'll tell you this because it's in the report. By the way, the report is available on the National Park Service education website, except for the burial chapter. But in that report, it actually says that they dug a big hole and they respectfully put all the bodies back in the hole at the site. So unlike many other sites where the bodies are spread all over Eastern institutions, museums, shelves, they're all still at the site. And that's kind of unusual, actually. Yes?
Actually, there are several bodies that remains at the Arizona State Museum, and we're actually doing NAGPRA on that now. And I couldn't tell you the numbers, but...
NAGPRA is a federal regulation that requires that you repatriate human remains, that tribes request that they be brought back to their point of origin. And so it sounds like that's what's going on. So there's a number, maybe those are some of the ones they were looking at, the physical attributes, yeah.
It's not all 400, some of them.
Yeah.
There was a skeletal remains in that museum a long time ago.
It wouldn't surprise me. It used to be that you could display human remains. In fact, when I first went to work at Pueblo Grande, in 1990, they had a body on display. And the first thing that I and the other archaeologists said was, it's got to go back in the storage room. It should not be out on display. Keep in mind, our burial law in the state of Arizona was passed in 1990. So from 1990, things have changed tremendously on how you treat human remains and their disposition and the requirement for consultation with Native Americans. Yes, Jim?
That burial was rather rich human objects, and it was really a late burial. Could have been towards the end of the Tuzigoot period there. And do you think that was the religious evolution was such at that time that that's why we had so much stuff that they didn't find any burials that rich?
Yes, it's very possible. They did, fortunately, other archaeologists went back later and got tree ring dates, a bunch of them. I think they had 3 tree ring dates, 2 or 3, the original excavations, and then later on they went back and got 28. And they do have a tree ring date of 1387 from the site, I believe. That was the latest one. Pretty close to the 1400 that Caywood and Spicer had guessed. And that's fairly late. So clearly there's a very late phenomenon at the site. More specifically, as you well know, there's a Katsina cult that became very prominent, that spread throughout the Southwest later. Chuck Adams has said it may not have been until the 1300s that it really arrived in this part of the state. And so that individual could have been one of those Katsina cult priests.
The general plot dated 1350 to 1400.
Right. Yeah, so you could be right. It could be related to this spread of the Katsina religion that became so influential at many sites in northern Arizona, yeah. Ken's got a question here now.
Speaking of that same individual, the left arm and wrist had substantially more decoration than the right. And it had some on the right, but you showed much more on the left side. And Alexander Stephenson has several references to where the Hopi would use the left hand for all religious ceremonies, putting on the Katsina face and doing other things. And the right side was considered somewhat defiled. And I noticed that the right one had black stones as opposed to the other side. Do you think that has some religious
I think that that's a possibility that should be considered, yes. Because why so much more one arm than the other? Again, that could be some kind of symbolic statement. And that's an excellent, I hadn't heard of that. I like that idea. I'm going to run with that, Ken. I thought I saw, here we go. I'll get to you next, yes.
You did touch on the salt mine.
Yes, yeah.
And I've been talking to a lot of people about it, or the museum, excuse me. And so I was wondering, and they are wondering, what has happened? I I know you said they went to a museum on the East Coast. Is there a chance we'll get those back? And if we did, are they funerary? Because they were found with a body.
Let's see, that was 3 questions.
I know. That's how I get it.
I know, you deal with children. No. They will not come back. I doubt it. They're at the Smithsonian. Forget it. They don't give up their stuff. Second, the materials were excavated by Earl Morris, and he wrote a short paper in 1928 that had photos, and when he did the excavations, the site was being destroyed by commercial operations. He was actually working somewhere else. He got the word there was this destruction. He came out. He did a pretty thorough excavation. There were 2 bodies in the salt mines, yes. Now, I think 2, as I recall. It's a good question because the next occasional papers that we're going to put out through our center is going to be a master's thesis that was done in 1992 by a woman who located all of his artifacts, located his notes, and located all of his 4x4 plate photographs and wrote her thesis on it. And she's agreed to allow us to republish that thesis as the next occasional paper of the center. So the first time a lot of this material that is unknown and hard to get is actually going to become available, and you're going to be able to read about everything that was recorded on the salt mine. So good question. That's a very important site, and I'm really happy that this woman has agreed to have her. She's in New York and did her thesis out of the SUNY Binghamton, New York, of all places. But it's an excellent thesis, and that's one of the next things Ken and I will be working on to get that out. She's already sent me the thesis. It's on 4 1/4 floppy disks.
But
So
if these artifacts were found with bodies, are they funerary?
they are. But there were other objects that were not with the bodies. There were picks that they were using to pick. There were torches that they were using so they could see, because some of these tunnels went way back in and they got dark. And so there's a lot of interesting artifacts that are not funerary objects. So I suppose we could borrow them for on loan and do exhibits or something with some of the materials. I would think so. Yeah, I'm glad to hear that because I'm really interested in exploring that Cape.
I was going to ask, I thought the human remains were associated with the cave-in, not burial. They were apparently exploring the salt mine or extracting.
That was Earl Morris's interpretation, but the woman says no. She thinks they're ritual burials, because when she studied salt, salt is an extremely sacred object in the Southwest. And so the idea of putting people into a salt mine and burying them there would have been a very powerful religious act. And so her argument is no, she doesn't think that they were cave-ins, that they would have been smart enough to know how to mine it. So you have the 2 different views on that.
The quality of the salt, I've heard that it fizzes. I don't know, is that true? Can you eat it like we eat table salt or what?
I don't know. That's a good question, though. I want to explore that further.
It's not potassium chloride, it's not sodium chloride, it's potassium. So it doesn't have quite the strong taste. And I've been with Lee Calwisma with it and given him either the rock or some of the
He's a Hopi person, yeah.
And what Lee has said is that he would take the rock salt and evaporate it 3 times, soak it and evaporate it. By the time you get the 3rd or 4th treatment, then it's better, but it's not a real salty taste. It's better for preservation, but he also said that the salt was so important that the women dispersed the salt and kept the salt, and the men got to do the corn. But the salt was very important.
Extremely valuable, yeah. I think you had a question?
I just am curious about the way it looks today and the way they finished the 35 reconstruction. Could there be 2 photographs? I live right.
Sure. I'm sure there are different photos showing the stages. I would imagine in the archives, perhaps even at the museum.
I wish we could see one. Because I never look up there, but I see people walking on those walls. It is a busy place.
After I went back and reread the report to prepare for this lecture, I thought, this would be a great study to go back in and look at all the notes and reissue another report on the excavations. Of course, that's a huge undertaking, and I'm always way too much on my plate anyway, but I think maybe for somebody's dissertation or something, there's a lot more information and a lot of photos and a lot of really interesting results that could be published in a wonderful book about Tuzigoot that's still out there in the future, I think. Yes, yes.
We don't allow people to walk on the walls. They can walk on the tower, but we've had continual masonry work, preservation work, getting rid of the Portland cement mortar. There's at least 35 applications of Portland cement, and we're replacing it with an amended mud that's more erosive than the stone. So if you see someone walking on the wall, I hope they're the masons or the archaeologists.
She just can see people walking
Yeah, on the sidewalk.
But that's a good point. Don't be walking on walls. I mean, that's just a good... And if you see people walking on them, if they don't look like they should be there, either say something to them or go tell the rangers that there's somebody walking on the walls. Yes, you're wondering who this expert over here, this is Kathy Davis. She's the superintendent for the monuments out here. And however, just retired. Wouldn't you retire? Not yet.
3 more work days.
3 more work days. So she's still an authority. She'll be an authority after. In fact, we're very happy that she has decided to be a member of our board of directors, and she just got elected as our new vice president of the center. So if we could thank her for that.
Can I just say, they didn't tell me there was a meeting, but I'm happy to serve. I'd also like to introduce Karen Hughes, who is our supervisory ranger, and also one of our law enforcement rangers.
Great, thank you for coming. Appreciate it. Any other questions? Yes, questions?
The priest burial, was it in the floor or was it in the midden?
I don't know.
They never said where it...
Not in the report. Now, besides, I don't want to talk about provenience information too much anyway. Again, it's a very delicate subject, and so we try to avoid getting too much in depth about burial discussions. Yes.
That room that had the roasting pit in it, they must have had some kind of ventilation somehow to keep things burning. It worries me that even they would have fire pits inside this structure with no ventilation. I know.
Well, you have the entryway in the ceiling. That would be your ventilation. No shafts like in northern Pueblo rooms. No, it all would ventilate. A lot of the rooms were fire blackened, so they were breathing in smoke, which is probably not very healthy for them. All right. Well, thank you for coming out. I hope you enjoyed it.